Welcome back. This is the Catholic Lady, and we are reading Great Line of God by Taylor Caldwell. It is a book that was written in 1970 and it is currently out of print. This is Chapter 8, Part 2. The women's quarters were not luxurious nor very handsome. They had the austerity of old Rome about them, and there were few ornaments, and only the statues of Clodia's family gods and her lares and penates. There were no murals here, and the lamps were plain and unscented, and the curtains over the uncolored Alexandrian glass of the windows were of coarse wool striped in red, black, and white hues of the tribe of Levi, to which Shavua ben Abraham belonged. Sephora thought it amusing, but not incongruous nor discordant, to find here a mixture of both Roman and Jewish customs and furnishings, for there was a curious resemblance and harmony between them. She realized at once that they were also anachronistic in this modern age of Hellenistic Jews and opulent Romans and degenerate Greeks. Clodia was seated in her own portico in an oaken chair with no cushions nor fringes, and she was like Demeter in her repose and dignity. About her women were not idle. They were sewing or spinning or embroidering, though it was night and the lamps were not many. Clodia herself held a heap of linen on her broad knees, and she was apparently mending it. She raised her calm brown eyes to Sephora's face, scrutinized her sharply and briefly, saw all, smiled with reserve, and held out her hand to the girl. Sephora kissed it with a fine affection of humility, and Clodia's eyes suddenly twinkled. She rose, embraced Sephora. She smelled of fresh bread and clean, strong flesh and warmth. "Greetings, my child," she said in Latin. "My son Ezekiel is greatly honored and blessed in you." Her coarse brown hair was partly covered with the same plain cloth as her stola, and they were both of a dull deep red. Her hands were the hands of a woman who was not ashamed to use them in labor or in the soil, and were dark and short. She was not so tall as Sephora. She was indeed, however, the terror of her household, which she ruled in the fashion of an old Roman, and her sons and her daughters feared her with excellent reason. Though her daughters were married, and were all her sons but Ezekiel, her youngest, they observed the most meticulous and deferential deportment in their mother's presence. Her features were large and coarse and firm, but when she smiled, her expression was truly kind and benevolent. Sephora loved her at once, for here was all sincerity and truth. Clodia and Sephora dined together in Clodia's austere dining room, which was small and dimly lighted. But the curtains were drawn back for the warm night wind, and Sephora saw the mingled red and white illumination of Jerusalem, and heard the dull thunder of the unsleeping city. She also heard fountains, plainchant and soothing, and distant laughter and music, and the rumble of chariots. She could smell rich gardens and fruit. The crescent new moon stood on the tiptoe of a dark mountain. Though Sephora was tired, she was filled with excitement and anticipation, for henceforth this would be her home. They dined very simply on broiled fish, hot breads, and stewed beans with garlic and cheese, and very ordinary wine, which Clodia favored. The gentleman's dinner was quite different, which Sephora suspected, but Clodia preferred a plain life for herself and her women. There was a rustic basket of fruit on the table, which was covered by a yellowish cloth, and the perfume of it mingled with the flower scents from the gardens and the pervading peppery and aromatic odor of the city. She was dressed and gemmed finely, thought Clodia, and is of delicate structure and proud bearing. But she is one like myself, and I am pleased. She inquired politely of Sephora's journey, and offered her condolences for the death of the girl's mother, and conveyed her unbending and formidable serenity to Sephora, who did not find it intimidating. In truth, the girl's weariness relaxed, and she found herself confiding in Clodia, as if she were her mother, and some of her remarks were so witty that Clodia laughed abruptly a few times. Sephora's composure and ease, her charming face, her smiles gratified the Roman lady. The girl was not imprudent, as were the majority of maidens in these deplorable days, and there was no impertinence in her voice, nor was she affected or brazen. They drank wine in warm comfort together, and ate of the luscious fruit. Sephora began to speak of her brother, and her anxious love for him shone in her golden eyes. She told Clodia of the strangeness which had come to him in the past year, and the fixity and gloom which nothing could shake. "Ah," said Clodia, "I saw him from the portico in the light of the lamps at the entrance to the atrium. He stood apart. That is very unusual for a youth, for the young are always chattering. Does he love no one?" "None but God and my father," said Sephora, with some melancholy. "Once he loved me, but no more. He repudiates me and thinks me trivial. I cannot touch him." Clodia reflected. She held a handful of sweet ripe dates in her hand, and she munched on them thoughtfully. Then she said, "I have seen a few young men like your brother Saul ben Hillel, but very few. He recalls my own brothers to me. We too were the stringent before our gods, and loved our country with fervor. At times," and now she suddenly looked at Sephora, and the unusually unrelenting brown eyes were amazingly merry, "I found it tiresome. Of a certainty, I never implied this to my father and my brothers, nor to my husband, David ben Shabua, but women have more humor than men." Sephora was freshly delighted by this Roman lady. The two women drew more comfortably together. "Virtue," said Clodia, "is most necessary, and discipline cannot be overpraised. We must learn this, my child, or we cannot endure in a world of men. We must be sleeplessly controlled and firm and guide them ruthlessly, or this world will surely revert to chaos. We must be veritable Penelopes on this gross masculine earth, veritable Junos, or our men will become barbarians. It is their nature, though they pretend in these days to be in excessive refinements and daintiness. Alas, modern women, striving to be as corrupt as men, as vicious as men, as free as men, are hastening us all to destruction. There are few virtuous women alive in these evil times, and only they can delay the inevitable hour of death, blood, and confusion." She sighed, studied a pomegranate in its basket, and then took up a red globe. She regarded Sephora with interest. The girl's face was somewhat disturbed. Clodia said, "Do not be sad, my daughter. Civilizations come and they go. The seed of their death lies in them at their birth. It is inexorable fate, ordained by the gods. Still," she added, "I often yearn for what I have not had." She gave a grim chortle. Sephora gazed at her, waiting. "Shabua ben Abraham mentioned to me, with amusement, that the Pharisee Jews believe in reincarnation," said Clodia Flavius, rubbing the pomegranate frankly on her knee. "If I were to be given a choice, in the event there is truth in that theory, I should like to be a courtesan." "A courtesan!" exclaimed Sephora, and her face came alight with dimples. "Then I would not have to be virtuous," said Clodia. "I am like a weary soldier on guard." Sephora laughed, but for some reason, unknown even to her, she felt tears in her eyes. She rose quickly to her feet and approached Clodia and fell on her neck and kissed her, and then did not know why she cried. And Clodia held her in her stout arms and soothed her, as she had never soothed her own daughters, and murmured wordlessly in her ear and kissed her cheek. Sephora sat on her knee like a child and wound her arms about Clodia, and the servant girls looked in upon them and were astonished. It was midnight, and Saul lay and astonished. It was midnight, and Saul lay in sweating exhaustion in his fine bedroom in the house of Shabuah ben Abraham, and his spirit was in darkness and in pain. He had recited his prayers with fervor this first night in the land of his fathers, but they had brought him no comfort. So he rose from his heated bed, covered his head with a cloth, and went over as if in agony, and murmured aloud in the words of David, O Lord, rebuke me not in your wrath, neither chasten me in your hot displeasure. For your arrows stick fast in me, and your hand presses me sore. There is no soundness in my flesh because of your anger, neither is there any rest in my bones because of my sin. My iniquities are gone over my head. As a heavy burden, they are too heavy for me. My wounds stink and corrupt because of my foolishness. I am troubled. I am bowed down greatly. I go mourning all the day long. For my loins are filled with a loathsome disease, and there is no soundness in my flesh. I am feeble and sore broken. I have roared by reason of the disquietuousness of my heart. Lord, all my desire is before you, and my groaning is not hid from you. My heart pants, my strength fails me. As for the light of my eyes, it is also gone from me. Forsake me not, O Lord, O my God, be not far from me. So on many endless nights before he had prayed thus in despair and in fervor and in utter faith, yet never had he been comforted, never had he felt forgiven, never had he felt the imminence of God as once he had felt it. Something obstinately cold and dark had fallen between him and God. He believed it was his sin, for which he could not forgive himself. Once, during his interlude with Dassel, he had loved all mankind, for it had reflected his love, and she was one with it, and it was one with her. Now that he believed, he loathed Dassel and hated her, so those somber emotions lay on all the world of men, emanating from himself. As he had repudiated Dassel, so he repudiated his fellows and despised them. For were they not depraved and corrupt as Dassel and as himself? He could not forgive himself. Therefore he could not forgive nor endure mankind. Could not God, blessed be his name, read his heart, know his contrition and sorrow and disgust? Why then did silence answer in him, and long loneliness and emptiness, as if in reproach? It was said that the Lord did not reject the repentant, but hastened to meet them in loving kindness. But though Saul had repented, the portals of communion with God had closed, and he was left in barrenness and dryness among evil men. And there was muteness and despair in his soul. In broken exhaustion he fell on his hot bed again, and was instantly asleep. He did not dream, but suddenly as he slept, and the crescent moon fell behind the mountains, and a new breeze chattered amid the palms, he heard a great and tremendous voice, Saul, Saul of Tarshish. He sprang up in bed, sweat dripping from him. His eyes wild and staring in the darkness, he cried, Yes, yes, who is it? Who calls? The very walls were still ringing with the sound of that unearthly voice, that commanding voice, that terrible and masculine voice. A fierce pain ran through the young man's head, and he panted. He listened with all his power. He heard now only the light, dry wind, and the call of a lonely bird, and the distant howl of a jackal, and the trumpet challenge of a guard. It was dreaming, I was dreaming, he told himself at last. But it was dawn before he slept again. Then he thought, Though he reject me and will not forgive me, though his rage shall flow over me like the billows of the sea, Still I will love and serve him with all my soul, and at the last he may receive me again. He wept and said in the words of Job, "Oh, that I but knew where I might find him." And that is the end of chapter 8.